The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.
That is true. Okay, this is Mae Brussell, and it's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. And this is broadcast number 622. It's July. It's November. I look at the 7th. Have to write it down because it goes so fast. November the 7th, 1983. The first week in November, there will be a lot of programs celebrating or recognizing or remembering John Kennedy. The month of November, there's a lot of articles coming out and television shows, and I can't forget that date. I started my research 20 years ago on the 22nd. And we'll update what's happened in the last 20 years, maybe in 1 hour. It's 2 weeks from now. I usually begin the program with a discussion of what we were talking about last year at this time. That was broadcast number 570, November the 8th, 1982. Edwin Wilson was in the news at that time, and he was in the news again tonight. They're trying to change some of the charges. He's been given a bunch of multiple charges for sending explosives overseas using commercial airlines, shipping explosives to Gaddafi, and also for hiring people to murder his wife and other witnesses to his trial. Edwin Wilson is in jail for quite a long time, although his name was in the news tonight on trying to reduce some of his connections he hasn't even been mentioned for his activity with Turple or Corcola. He's being tried alone. And George Corcola is in some jail in the United States very quietly, and they certainly don't want those trials to be in the news too much. So once in a while you get a little bit of news, and he was mentioned tonight. A year ago I was talking about Michael Ledeen and the exposure of Ledeen in the State Department working with Roberta Calvi and Francesco Pazienza and Alexander Haig and the White House. And Ledeen is the Minister of Propaganda for the Vatican and for the State Department, and he was pushing that Bulgarian story that the Bulgarians tried to shoot the Pope when it actually involved Frank Turple, the same gang, Wilson and Turple's gang, and the CIA shooting at the Pope in May of 1981. Ronald Reagan was shot in March, and the Pope was shot in May. And Ledeen connections came out just a year ago on his relationship to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and his work with the far right wing of the intelligence of the United States and the Vatican, and a propagandist for the Vatican. There was an article about a helpful Nazi who evaded justice. This was SS Major Friedrich Bussard. He was one of the men who worked with Franz Sieks to set up the special forces of the Green Beret. And he worked on Radio Free Liberty. I was talking about him a year ago. Well, you saw the Marines and the Special Forces and the Rangers in action down in Grenada this week. How the mercenaries and the Special Forces and the Pentagon are taking over the decision-making of the Congress of who we make war with and where we invade. And even if it's a British protectorate, we go into that area. That's Special Forces that was brought over and formed by Adolf Hitler and these particular people that I mentioned a year ago. A year ago, John DeLorean had just been arrested, and one half of that program last year and then two other programs afterwards went into his background. His father, Ford Motor Company, his mother from Vienna, and the image of him and the California connections, and his first money coming from Allstate Insurance from Sears. In 1975, his relationship to Pete Wilson, who then became Senator Pete Wilson from California, and 10 years of nightmares, people that he had busted and taken their money and broken up their inventions and exploited them, somebody in Phoenix and Kansas and Los Angeles, Idaho, and Orange County. And now the DeLorean Motors got formed over in Ireland. In the interim, since this last year when he was first arrested and this came out, we found out of the money that he had came directly from Henry Bushkin, the partner of Johnny Carson with that bank in Beverly Hills, with links to Robert Duran and Jack Catane. That DeLorean Motors, besides being funded by Great Britain and the United States, a hunk of it came right out of the crime syndicate to set it up in the first place. And I mentioned his relationship to banks, the Cayman Islands and continental Illinois, and the familiarity of the DeLorean to a lot of the other conspiracies that I've talked about. And if any of you are interested in the John DeLorean story, I did 3 broadcasts last year, and you can get those. Just a little humor in a time that's not really very funny. There were a couple of things I saw in the paper this week. Disneyland has come a long way since old Walt kicked the bucket. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, of all things, that Disneyland refused to drop the flags to commemorate the death of 230 servicemen who died in Lebanon. And it's actually an article in the Wall Street Journal. Disneyland's refusal to drop flags for Marine dead stirs controversy. And some people objected, and the people in Anaheim, California, said that this is a magic kingdom, and we come here to have a good time, and except when the president dies or when Walt Disney died, they don't put the flags at half-mast. They did it when Walt Disney died, and they said, as far as the guys in Lebanon, they only let one flag half-mast, and that was at Main Street over by the post office. They have poles at the post office. Well, the post office is a washroom, men's and ladies' room. They don't mail anything, and nothing comes in. It's not a real post office, but they let one flag down, and the rest stayed up. So they're getting a little ornery. Walt Disney was so conservative that I got a kick out of seeing this in the Wall Street Journal, that somebody objected that the flags weren't half-mast. And then there was another article in the Houston Post about a man who wants special examination his mother wants for him because he's allergic to the 20th century. And he lives in a cave in Madison, Wisconsin, and he wants the federal government and Social Security to give him $1,000 a month. His mother wants because her son eats lion's meat, and he lives in a cave and just has fresh fruits and beans and lion's meat. And she has what she calls it a 20th century syndrome that her son is suffering from, and he's allergic to the modern environment and modern diet. So he sleeps most of the time in a cave, and she takes him food and cleans up the supplies, and he sleeps, and she brings him lion's meat. So she wants an increase of $1,000 a month because that would be the cost of his allergy to the 20th century. I thought that was pretty good. There's a magazine out, The Hustler, that is on the stand now that has a lot of political articles. I was surprised how many there were, but one in particular starting. It'll be out a month from today. The February issue is the article on Larry McDonald and the Korean airline Flight 007. Larry Flint has his name on that article. He wanted to put his name as the author of the article. I don't know how it happened, but I already got a telephone call from the Washington Post today regarding that article. And I think it's going to send a lot of ripples around the powers that be, and the Washington Post is already going to proceed on some stories on Larry Flint and the story. See, it's been very suppressed all over the country about the Los Angeles Police Department and the current file of the ACLU with 131 plaintiffs against the Los Angeles Police Department for not only keeping records and files on spying that were supposed to be destroyed for 10 years ago, but they kept them and put them into the $100,000 computer that belonged to Larry McDonald of Western Goals. And this has not made the Associated Press or the United Press or the Wire services. They've tried to suppress that story by keeping it in the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner or the Los Angeles Times. And when the man called from the Washington Post today and wanted to know where I got some of my information, I said the front page of the Washington Post, August the 19th, has the story of Larry McDonald and Western Goals having to come to California to testify about the $100,000 computer that was being fed illegal documents that were supposed to have been destroyed, that were being taken as a result of the lawsuit into a garage in Long Beach. And I said 12 days later he was dead. And these files contained 8 years of information when Ronald Reagan was governor. So 1 month from now, Hustler will be on the stand with the 007 story. And then within a week, it's being printed now, a week and a half, Rebel is coming out. Rebel's going to be the size of Time and Newsweek. And the first issue will come out on the anniversary of the murder of John Kennedy. And 1 month later, there will be another issue, and then it will roll once a week. And I told the fellow from Washington Post that they publish Newsweek. And I said, Larry Flint's going to get out a magazine once a week, and it's going to have all the news that Time and Newsweek don't print. that can be documented. It's not like the National Enquirer. It's going to be a lot of good news, 96 pages every single week. And I'll be writing 20-page story every week for that. And I did, the first story is on the JFK assassination, the Nazis. I mentioned on the air before, but there's always new listeners. So start looking in your newsstands for The Rebel. That will be out. I don't know when. He is in a hurry to get it out. The 22nd is 2 weeks away. And Larry Flint's going to go down to Dallas and have a motorcade and duplicate the route of John Kennedy on the anniversary of Kennedy's assassination. He's decided to fly into Dallas, and he'll probably distribute 500,000 copies of that issue of The Rebel right around Dallas. And it has to do with a lot of people in Dallas, Texas, and their links to Adolf Hitler's Nazis and General Walker and the Nazis and Michael and Ruth Paine. I don't think they live there now. She moved to Florida. But with General Walter Dornberger, he's dead, but they were very much alive at the time of the Kennedy assassination. And Robert Morris has a university in Dallas, and he travels between there and Princeton. But there are plenty of current people it'll affect in Dallas, and that's out. That'll be out this next week. The current issue of Hustler has the gospel, according to Larry, and it has a long one-page story on why he's a candidate for president of the United States. I don't know how many of you saw it, but he announced his candidacy. He said, I'm white, I'm wealthy, and I'm pornographic, and that makes him qualified to be like all the other people that are running. And he explains why he wants to run, to remove the repressive hand of government that controls the legislation, and he'll make different changes in the areas of health, education, and welfare. And he has strangely enough, it's a pretty good platform for why he wants to be president of the United States. It's certainly as good as any of the other people that are running, and it's a lot more interesting. And he says I'm sure that you would rather prefer somebody than a Hollywood ham or an addle-brained astronaut. He says, wouldn't a smut peddler who cares be more important? So, and he also calls attention to the fact that the Constitution was written by the haves for the haves, that they never imagined a homogeneous society like it is now, or a Caspar Weinberger or a Dr. Strangelove Kissinger, and that you have to get rid of these people because the Constitution never provided for those kinds of people, and that if he were president, he would rearrange things and get the executive and the legislative and the judicial back on kilter the right way they should be. He said he's seen these political quacks drunk with big shot politicians. I've been dragged through the courts and slipped money to most of them, and I know what a bunch of lying, cheating, scheming bastards they are. And so he thinks that he would do just as good a job. And so the gospel, his campaign promise, is in Hustler if you want to read it. Also, Penthouse has an article this month. I just got the Penthouse today, but that's by one of my favorite authors, Jim Hogan, and it's an article it's about Frank Churchill. He interviewed Frank Churchill, and Frank Churchill is warning about the PLO and the violence that could take place at the Los Angeles Olympics, and that's what I have said for a long time is being arranged. Well, Larry McDonald worked, and this is in the article of the 007 that'll be out next month in the Hustler, works with George Habash, the late Larry McDonald, who set up the PLO and the massacre in Munich, Germany. And the excuse for Western goals having material in their computer from the police department was to prevent violence in Los Angeles at the time of the Olympics, and yet the man who was getting the information into the computer was the man who worked with the people that caused the last violence. So here's Frank Churchill warning about the PLO, and maybe the expose of Larry McDonald will come in time if we continue articles, because the Olympics are not until the summer, and I'll be doing a 20-page story every week for Rebel, and it will hit on a lot on the Olympics and the terror and the origin of the Green Berets and the Special Forces and Squad 19 in L.A. and the plans for the military coup and the garden plot that Ronald Reagan planned when he was governor. So I'm going to do, I think, part two. The second article will be on the Nazis in Dallas, because even 54 pages, I couldn't get it all in. So the second issue of Rebel will be on the Nazis and the Kennedy assassination, and then I'll probably go right into the Los Angeles Police Department and hit Western goals and LAPD maybe every week for 4 or 5 weeks until the subject's never saturated and updated. I could do 4 or 5 consecutive evenings on World Watchers with you right now, just on news of the LAPD trial that's going on and new information. As a matter of fact, several weeks ago, I had a quotation from the law office of William French Smith, and that's Ronald Reagan's law office at Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. And they were trying to stop the testimony of a Mr. Rothmiller from the police department, and they said, if we let him go, it'll be a floodgate, and he'll take us all the way around the world. There'll be so much material. And I think that was just 2 weeks ago, I was referring to that wonderful quotation that they're so frantic that in the first hearings of the ACLU trial, before it goes right into the court, which is pretty soon, they're getting various pieces of information. Well, this week there was an article, or last week in the LA Times, on a man named Mr. Terry, and I want to do a whole broadcast on him too. And he's an organized crime figure who works with Ronald Reagan. He's pictured photographed with Nancy Reagan, and he works with the mob figures out of Chicago and out of Fort Lauderdale, and with Mayor Bradley. He works with Marvin Davis and the Henry Kissinger, the 20th Century Crowd Group. And Terry not only works with the organized crime syndicate, but he armed Argentina and sending Argentine weapons and Nazis down there. And his name came up during the hearings of Mr. Rothmiller for the ACLU suit. They smoked out this Mr. Terry. So that's what the Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher law office meant when they said you'll take us all the way around the world, because what's going on down there is such a tangling mess of names, and the law offices, as I say, of the President of the United States are handling the Los Angeles Police Department, which really is a scandal because there's a little conflict of interest with his record as governor in that in those files down there. Now, Frank Turple, the article is about Frank Turple, and Jim Hogan is the man who wrote Spooks and who wrote about Intertel. He's a very detailed, good author. I'm going to read this tomorrow, the first thing in the morning. Can't read it tonight. There's too much work to do. And it's a detailed Nuganan Bank and various people from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA and the Organized Crime Syndicate and Murder Incorporated and the transfer of guns and silencers and weapons that Frank Turple uses and distributes, silencing devices, binary explosives, poison kits, helicopter, electronic eavesdropping he sends all over the world, military uniforms. This is like Otto Skorzeny at the Battle of the Bulge, supplying American uniforms to Germans to confuse the Americans. Well, that is in the Penthouse this month. It's just on the stand. Get that. And along in that same issue is an article, another one of my favorite subjects. The article is by Ashley Montague. He's a well-known writer. He's a professor at Princeton. I haven't heard much about him or read much about political theory in a long time once I got to the hard facts of the world. But he has an article about the book The Terminal Man. In 1973, Michael Crichton wrote the book The Terminal Man. And I've said many times that it's based upon a real man who had his brains removed, and they put electrodes in and magnet kind of things in his brains, and they took the Polaroid camera away from them. The land camera was taken from him. The doctors did the surgery were Dr. Vernon H. Mark, a neurosurgeon, and Frank Irvin, a psychiatrist, who were Crichton's teachers at Harvard University. And at the time that the blacks were rioting, when Martin Luther King was killed and Malcolm X, and they were protesting, they wanted to study why blacks riot, what makes them violent. So they were taking the brains of people. And I've talked many times that Mark and Irvin came out to UCLA to work with Ronald Reagan when he was the governor with Jolly West. And this fits into what we were talking before the program began about UCLA and their experimentation with brain cells. Now, he's actually talking about the 34-year-old engineer whose brains they took and experimented on, this inventor. And there was a lawsuit in Los Angeles. He moved to Long Beach with his mother, and at the time of the lawsuit against these doctors, he was put in Veterans Hospital, and he was violent and tearing things apart, and Dr. Irvin and Sweet were still at Boston, and they didn't tell them at the Veteran Hospital that they had these electrodes in him, and there was so much radiation coming out of his head, they had to put a wastebasket on his head in the courtroom, and he was reduced just to garbage, his brain. And they took the invention. I began to study that when I was studying what happens to inventors in this country, how they're killed, their inventions are stolen, they're charged with murder, their families are broken up. And NASA and the top think tanks in the United States literally steal their inventions. And this is a subject that is very close to what I have been involved with studying. There isn't too much. You can't make 26-inch file cabinet on this case. It's a tragedy. But all of a sudden, Ashley Montagu is catching on to this and naming these people in this magazine. And so I'll read that, and I hope all of you get this issue of Penthouse. And just today there was a story, an Associated Press story, of a new book coming out of it's in Washington, but it says author claims the Soviets are perfecting mind control. The Soviet Union has achieved significant progress towards developing mind control weapons, and this has to do with brain activity and how they are affecting our lives. And there's a new book called Psychic Warfare, Threat or Illusion, warning the Pentagon and the United States intelligence agencies. It's written by Martin Ebon, E-B-O-N, warning us about the accelerated mind control of the Soviet Union. Well, that's in the newspaper today, November the 7th, 1983. And here Ashley Montagu is finally catching on to not only a movie was made, but I knew Crichton, Michael Crichton. I think he wrote Coma, and he knows, I think he's a doctor, and he knows a lot about what is going on. And I didn't realize, of course I should have known, that he worked right at Harvard, the home base of Henry Kissinger and a lot of other people, some good people, but some sleazy. So that the article on this Terminal Man is in the new Penthouse. And what I'll do, I'm making a list of things to write every week because I'll do a weekly story for Rebel. And when I get home from World Watchers, I do all this work on Mondays and then share with you Monday night, and it goes out by subscription. Then what I'm going to do is Tuesday write a 20-page story with the best of the week that will go out each week to the Rebel, so that I can pull from my files the story of the surgery that was done on this man. The Terminal Man is a real man, and then use an example of some other scientists that were taken and their lives rearranged. Now, I want to get on to what's going down in Grenada because it is a symptom of a situation that's going to escalate way out of control. As I mentioned earlier, after killing this poor Maurice Bishop, they'll next take Arafat. He's being closed in, and then it'll be Gaddafi, and then they'll take over El Salvador. And Fidel Castro will be killed next. They're out wanting Fidel Castro's blood, and then take over Nicaragua and El Salvador, and then they'll come to us. Those special forces will round you up. That's what the computer banks are for. That's what Western Goals is for Americans, Californians, and they have offices in every state. You don't think that's just for some vague place that they're going to all this trouble. No, those are for you out here in California and whoever I'm talking to. The Western Goals has offices in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and everywhere else. There was an article in Covert Action in 1980, that was 3 years ago, by Ken Lawrence, who writes very good articles on CIA assassinations in Part 2. He said the pace of political assassinations has picked up considerably. This is 3 years ago. The murder of Walter Rodney in Guyana on June 13th, that was 1980. The attempted murder in Grenada of the Prime Minister Maurice Bishop 6 days later. Bishop came in 1979, and there was an attempt to murder him by the CIA, and then the stabbings in Jamaica and the killings and Manley's murder and the stabbing rather and the taking over the government there. And this article mentioned in the Philippines, this was long before Aquino was murdered. It said in June, the Philippine Liberation Courier published information that CIA had plotted the assassination of Philippine nationalist leader Claro Recto in 1960. That was 3 years before John Kennedy was killed. According to documents in the Naval War College, U.S. Ambassador Raymond Spruance and the CIA Station Chief Brigadier General Ralph Lovett discussed assassinating him as far back as 1954. And the article goes on to the hit team of Cuban terrorists involved in at least 12 murders since 1974. This is written in 1980. Discussed by the Central Intelligence Agency from the police in South Africa and in Chile, the organizations of BOSS, B-O-S-S, of the South African police and the DINA, the secret police in Chile, after Allende was murdered and Pinochet was in the murders that escalated there. The Cuban nationalist movement in Miami and Union City, New Jersey. DINA had killed at least 17 agents of the Cuban intelligence service. Out of New Jersey is where George Corcola came, who works with Edwin Wilson. And then the article goes on to say that several of the CIA supplied teams to kill former Chilean General Carlos Prats and his wife Cora. They were murdered in October 1974, and Michael Townley was released from jail for the murder charge of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat in Washington, D.C. in 1976. And he was supposed to be sent down to Argentina, and the United States government didn't send him. The Argentine don't want him, and the CIA was directly involved in the murders down there of the Chilean General Pratt and his wife. And then the bombing, they had a car bombing. And then the Chilean Minister of Defense, Oscar Bonilla, was blown up with 5 other people in Chile in March of 1975. These are all CIA murders. I'm leading up to Mr. Maurice Bishop the last week and a half ago. And then they had a list of other murders and people that worked for the CIA who bragged about killing the 17 operatives and so forth, working out of the CIA. And they said all of this happened at a time when the Rockefeller Commission was working, investigating the Central Intelligence Agency, when the Pike Committee from the House of Representatives was investigating the CIA and assassinations, and Senator Frank Church was aggressive against journalists who were ferreting out the assassination teams. So in 1980, this article by Ken Lawrence was to the point that they were out escalating the murders. Well, you see what's happening now and how terrible it is today. There was an article, Hawks want Castro. The White House is getting bells, alarm bells, get Fidel Castro, the State Department and the Pentagon, and that will be next. And all of these people who wanted some form of social change, who really didn't hurt America or threaten America at all, but won't get involved in their drug traffic and a lot of other problems. I heard on the TV tonight, Mr. Bishop took 40% unemployment in 3 years. It was down to 14% unemployment, and brought in medical help and hospitals and schools, and for that he was murdered. Now, also, this was a while back in 1980, December 1980. That was 3 years ago. This is 1983. There was an article in, this is by Jonathan Block and Pat Fitzsimmons, in Covert Action, the Eastern Caribbean and the Coast Guard. Now, this has to do with one month after Mr. Bishop was in. It said there are plans to create an Eastern Caribbean Regional Coast Guard by the United States. They're drawing up for 2 years on the drawing board. That's just about time right now. There will be a united police command with a residual defense capability, and the trend is towards collaboration and mutual defense agreements to stop Cuba's influence and to stop the Grenadian revolution that had an impetus just for 1 month. This came out a month after Bishop was in. The plans call for a coordinated defense effort begun early in 1979 when the idea was discussed between Prime Minister Tony Adams of Barbados and then British Prime Minister James Callaghan after Callaghan visited Barbados. The Grenadian Revolution in March 79 hastened the establishment of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. See, in 1979, when Maurice Bishop came in there, then they quickly got an organization that just several weeks ago said, come save us. And that was the excuse to do it. And the organization was set up in 1980, 1 month after he was elected. There were no medical students threatened, no lives threatened. And 1 month after he was elected, they set up a team that was to come in and save them. So that shows you how insidious it was. They had a team, and not only did they have it, but it says Britain's interest in the project was summed up by the Conservative Foreign Minister, Lord Carrington, during his visit in Barbados in 1980. Now, I mentioned last week that social disease called Henry Kissinger, and Kissinger Associates and Congressman Gonzalez asking on the floor of Congress to find out if our State Department is leased to Henry Kissinger and Kissinger Associates with Lord Carrington. Now, this is Kissinger's partner, and he referred to him as a hired gun on the floor of Congress in September before Bishop was murdered. So the same Lord Carrington, who's the partner of Henry Kissinger, was down at Barbados in 1980 saying we can't have an elected person like Bishop, even if he employs them, even if he educates them, even if he medicates them. We have to get help, and we need the development and training of police and ships to be ready. So the United States interest in the East Caribbean increased after the Grenadian Revolution. This was published December 1980, 3 years ago, if you have any doubt about how this thing got started in the last couple of weeks, and with all the diversions that Ronald Reagan had. And we'll go into those for the second half hour. We'll take a 1-minute break now and remind you that it's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, and it's Mae Brussell talking about the Caribbean and the murder of Mr. Bishop and the intent to take over the islands when he was elected 3 years ago. Now, we'll get back to Mr. Bishop and the plans. I have other articles on the United States government planning to arrange the island. You see, it wouldn't matter what Mr. Bishop did. He's not appointed by Henry Kissinger or Fritz Kramer or General Graham of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He is not part of their team. He's not the Harvard graduate. He got a law degree in London, Mr. Bishop, the late Bishop, but Prime Minister. But by when he was in 1979 in March, by 1980, Henry Kissinger's partner, Lord Carrington. Also, Lord Carrington was forced to leave Great Britain as the executive in Parliament at the time of the Falkland War because he hadn't told Prime Minister Thatcher and the powers that be about various activity of the Falklands and the Argentinians, and seemed to be holding back in favor of the Argentinians. And it is the same team of that Mr. Terry in Los Angeles working with 20th Century Fox and Stanfield Turner and Marvin Davis and Henry Kissinger is on the board that are funding weapons to Argentina. If you don't catch on to what's coming down, just get the back tapes and put it together and you'll be able to add it up. This article from Covert Action says the United States interest began after the Grenadian Revolution, when the possibility of increased Cuban influence was feared. It wasn't so much that Cuba would help educate them or do anything for them. Russia hadn't even sent in a nickel yet. It was that we want our hands on everything that's going on all over the world, and therefore they had to begin a group. The British intelligence had a think tank, along with our CIA, started in August 1980, called the Institute for the Study of Conflict, and they published the 121st Conflict Study, the Caribbean Strategic Vacuum. And that was as soon as Mr. Bishop was elected. That is pretty scary. That is why I mentioned to you on the radio many times, and it's in the article I did for Rebel on the Kennedy assassination, that 1960 was the important year for John Kennedy when he was running against Richard Nixon, because if he happened to win and Nixon was the candidate, there were all the contingencies to kill John Kennedy that were set in motion in 1960. One was the Permandex organization from Italy and New Orleans and Clay Shaw and all over the world, the International Murder Incorporated. And there was Young Americans for Freedom, which is the military branch and not the think tank of the campus. Young Americans for Freedom were lauding Ronald Reagan this week. It was his finest hour as he went into battle against this tawny nation. And there were a group of people, I call them the Christian Right, the group that I've talked about, Mr. Gale and Mr. the Brading and Lauren Hall and William Seymour, the people that were in New Orleans and were in Dallas, linked to the Fundamental Christian, and Mr. William Colonel Charles Willoughby of the Philippines, the one I've done broadcasts on from Heidelberg to Madrid, the fascists. These teams were set up, the Christian Right and the YAF and Permandex, and also Robert Mayu working with the Howard Hughes organization. And I go into the Carl Boyer public relation organization that also represented Adolf Hitler through the entire war. The Mayu was CIA, counterintelligence, FBI, when he hired Sam Giancana and John Rosselli as a hit team to let the mob figures beneath them hire other people for murder. There were 4 hit teams moving in 1960 in case John Kennedy won the election. The YF from Munich with General Walker and the Munich Nazis, the Christian Right, the Armed Christian Right, which is the special forces in the private military army today, the Posse Comitatus, the Permandex, and the Howard Hughes Mayu organization with Adolf Hitler. I know you'll like the article in the Rebel. That's one section called 1960. And I think it's a good article because you can take it as a framework for things that come in the news that I talk about, and we can put it back into that time slot, because that election, as soon as Mr. Bishop takes over in the Barbados in March, by 1980, January 80 and February, they have a contingency to get rid of him, and they do it. 2 years later, they get rid of him. And as I say, now they've had this contingency to kill Fidel Castro ever since he was in office, and now they're trying to go ahead and arrange to kill Fidel Castro. Now, to stress the point that these are military operations, I just brought in 3 articles, but one was from the San Francisco Examiner last week. The military is gaining clout in U.S. foreign policy. And this is a very important story in terms of chronology. The story says the Reagan administration once again was brandishing its power in a new show of force. It was once more a symbol of what members of Congress describe as the most militant American foreign policy since the 60s, when LBJ put the Pentagon in charge. When John Kennedy was just buried on November the 24th, the Pentagon Papers show how the Pentagon escalated the war against North Vietnam on that day, the day that John Kennedy was put in the ground. This article says the administration is using military force instead of foreign policy. It is relying on bullets instead of brains. That's a quotation of Representative Barbara Boxer, a Democrat from Greenbrae. The State Department officials said there's no question the military is playing the bigger role in foreign policy than in any preceding administration. From the start of the invasion, military and diplomatic considerations took a turnaround. The military came first, and they turned over to the Pentagon all White House decisions. At the request of the Defense Department, everything went to Caspar Weinberger. The operation was under total Pentagon control during the hostilities until they ceased. Throughout that period, the White House and the State Department routinely referred all questions about Grenada to the Pentagon. Now, the Nicaragua is going to be the same. Cuba is going to be the same. Lebanon, they're going to go in and kill Arafat, and then they're going to kill Gaddafi. They're going to let the Pentagon. It says an unusually large number of professional military men, active or retired, are in key positions. Now, this is very important. The 3 officials of the National Security Council are professional military men. This is unprecedented. Okay, I mean, even that crowd Kissinger, well, he never really went to war. He sat on a haystack during the Battle of the Bulge. The top man, Robert McFarlane, is a retired Marine colonel. He was over in Lebanon in the Middle East and took Mr. Clark's place, slid into Clark's place one day, the same day that Mr. Bishop was arrested. Mr. McFarlane slid into the chair. The chronology is always important. You know how I like to study the dates. October the 13th, Clark is out. The rancher from San Luis Obispo is out. October the 13th, Bishop is arrested, and McFarlane is in charge of national security. Under him, or his top deputy, is John Poindexter, a rear admiral in National Security Council. And, of course, under him would be John Lehman, the Navy frogmen were the first ones to go there. And McFarlane's executive secretary is Robert Kimmitt, Kimmitt, a retired Army major. The administration strategic arms negotiator, Edward Rowney, is a retired general. And Jonathan Howe, Howe, of the State Department's top arms control advisor, is an admiral. The rising authority of the uniformed military. It's here. The influence of the Joint Chief of Staff, and particularly their chairman, Army General John Vesey, Jr., has been on the rise. Reagan gave Vesey control over Grenada, including the responsibility to manage all the news that Vesey chose to keep the reporters out. The militarization policy has led to repeated efforts to seek military solutions to complex social, economic, or political problems. The slavery, the poverty, the poor medical conditions, the lack of education, the opportunities of what we call the banana republics run by Chase Manhattan and John McCloy and so forth in America, keeping them impoverished. Once they caught on to the means of education to raise themselves up, just like we had a revolution in this country, which was even entirely different. Once they caught on to the means of bettering their standard of living, all the leaders have to be killed, and they have to be kicked back, the bucket kicked out from under, either hang or become slaves and shut your mouth. This Examiner story says there's an attitude that we've been kicked around in the world too often, and we haven't been playing hardball. We didn't play hardball, you understand, in the Philippines or in South Korea or in Chile. We've been too soft in Brazil and Nicaragua and with Mr. Somoza and with the Shah of Iran and Southeast Asia and Turkey. We've been very soft with Jordan, and you understand, we're patsies. We put in 77 military dictatorships and puppets of the United States, but we're too soft. And all we keep saying is Afghanistan over and over again as the example. So the excuse is we're tired of being soft. We want to play hardball. We're going to use, the question is whether we're going to use the system well or be clumsy. So the military is in there good. And if you look at the regimes and what is going on in the world, we're not allowing them to play at all. If Burma coexists with North Korea in trades, we have a bombing incident there and force North Korea and Burma to fight with each other or to arm China against the Soviet Union. Now that China is fully employable and has no venereal diseases, takes care of their old and so forth, we have to get them into opium again and into weapons again. Very important story on the military because each of these people, there's a little bio. Another story from the Washington Post. The backers of the military build-up seen gaining. And there's a picture of Caspar Weinberg. And it says, as soon as Reagan became president, his defense secretary, Caspar Weinberger, rejected the Carter administration's 1.5 war doctrine, that we don't have to keep ships ready for 1.5 wars at any time, that we can be in Honduras, we can be in Grenada, we can be in Lebanon, we can be anywhere. And Weinberger has drafted a budget of 1985 for $322 billion. That's an excess. It was supposed to be $262 billion. He wants more. The Marines will soon, in November, be having a mock invasion of Central America using Honduran troops as part of a planned exercise for November. The Green Berets are training Salvador soldiers in Honduras. Army troops are building military facilities. They're conducting joint exercises there, and the elite corps of the Army Rangers, the same ones that went into to Grenada, 700 troops from the Ranger Battalion were formed in 1975. 1975. This is for the complete wipe-up of anybody who gets haughty, you understand? And they're practicing parachuting between enemy lines, moving swiftly with surprise, carrying no heavy equipment, just a few weapons and their rifles, and the Army is elated. Now, that is why I say you have to go back to the history of the Berets and these teams that were formed, Galen's group behind the lines after the war, the special forces formed by Adolf Hitler's, really the war criminals that came to this country. And I was talking about one of them a year ago tonight. Another story from Gallup poll, and you wonder, who is the Gallup poll and where they come from? They come out of Princeton University, probably run by Henry Kissinger's brother from there, or Robert Morris in Princeton, or Gerard O'Neill, and it's a repository of the Allen Dulles Library. And I use these institutions as symbols of not becoming famous for what they give to this world, but for what they're taking from it. Out of Princeton, George Gallup says, support rises for the spending on U.S. defense. That was last week. In the aftermath of the South Korean airline incident, the public support for the reduction in defense spending has fallen. People want more weapons. They want the president to get tough. They want him to deal with the Soviet Union. And they're willing to go into debt, any amount of figure, print the money, and inherit these debts. And the inflation is going up again. The economic inflation, according to reports this week, they tried to keep it down till the elections are over. But the important thing is the debt will increase and we'll all pay it. It is so pathetic, but all of this script was visible years and years ago if people wanted to know it. There's an report witness of Grenada's murder of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, and in case you didn't read it, it told how they took him off and the soldiers took him and shot him beyond recognition. They riddled his body with bullets. He tried to surrender to soldiers. He was told he was going to be executed. Then he was riddled with so many bullets, his body was beyond recognition. tonight's news, they want to make them look civilized, so they said they're looking for the body. November the 3rd, it was beyond recognition. When Bishop was told he would be executed, he took a deep sigh, folded his arms, and turned around. Three of the soldiers just shot them, and they fell to the ground, the people that were with him. His entourage, 4 cabinet ministers and 2 trade union leaders, were shot by soldiers, and he was gunned down beyond recognition. The bodies were taken. This is the report out of the Washington Post. They were taken to Calvany and burned in a hole filled with wood. And yet, as I say tonight, it's all, we've occupied a place we might have found it. They want to give him, a burial. The people are asking where he is. He was shot beyond recognition and burned in a hole filled with wood. They did this with Che Guevara, the CIA, and Klaus Barbie and Edwin Wilson and Frank Churchill and Murder Incorporated. They didn't want any martyrs or heroes, so they did this to Che Guevara. And they said this is the way he died. Then it goes on to say the ministers, that Hamilton, the witness, said the soldier fled to the Caribbean nation of Trinidad and Tobago last Tuesday, the day that the task force invaded. Now, they've arrested 2 people. There were 3 or 4 people that shot and did this act, and 2 have been arrested. It's sort of like getting the patsies and letting the rest go to Barbados or Grenada. Now, if you remember the map of Jonestown that is very close by to Grenada, the Jonestown area, they fled. Mr. Blakey fled with a yacht of Jim Jones and went down to Barbados, went north to Barbados, and there were over 120 killers that injected and poisoned and shot the people at Jonestown before they could escape in the forest, and then they covered them up with blankets. And I'm sure that some of this team or these killers could be from that same ilk. And speaking of Jonestown, I wanted to bring up the subject of the medical school because it was a hush-hush story that the medical school not the medical school is located, but the mental hospital was done away with. And because the story broke in Great Britain, we wouldn't allow the press there. And one fellow was interviewed from the mental hospital. He says, they put me in every year since 1972. He goes in and out, and he didn't know why he was there. And there was a big secret about the bombing of this mental hospital and who the patients were. And finally, a newspaper story November the 1st said the United States admits that they bombed the hospital early in the invasion, and 20 may have died, but we haven't seen any of the patients from the mental hospital. And I have a feeling that this was a continuation of a mind control program that was going on that was stopped in 1978 in Jonestown because they were flown out of the mental experimentations there to other islands and up to hospitals in Puerto Rico. And they killed 20 patients, and when Congressman Leo Ryan went down to Jonestown, every one of those people had to be killed for if they were allowed out. You could see the degree of mental experimentation. And I said that at the time. So there was this long delay in admitting that these people, these patients were there. And you haven't seen any interviews about how many were there and how many were in the hospital. But attached to that medical school, as part of the medical school, is a story about the man who was in charge, Mr. Bourne. Remember the name Peter Bourne at the time of Jimmy Carter's administration, and for a lot of other reasons that I'll run down with you. The Washington Post had a story about the medical school, the Foreign Medical School at Grenada, that was founded in 1977. Well, George Bush was director of the CIA in 1977 from January 30th, 76 to March 77. And Bush was the director in the National Security Council with the top secret meetings when they decided to go ahead and invade this island and the way they would invade it. And the story I have about this this medical school being set up was that it was set up in 1977, which was when George Bush was director of the CIA. Its founder was Charles Modica, 37. He's a lawyer. He's not even a doctor. He wanted to be a doctor, but he couldn't get into medical school. So he formed his own medical school with a group of wealthy physicians, several of whom have children, who were rejected by U.S. medical school. And I wonder if they were attached to the Central Intelligence Agency, because the medical school, this was the excuse for invading the island, was the medical school. And the first thing they did was to bomb out a mental hospital, and goodness knows what was going on in the mental hospital. The vice chancellor of the hospital is Dr. Jeffrey Bourne, B-O-U-R-N-E, retired from Emory University, and the father of Dr. Peter Bourne, a former advisor to President Carter. Scholars from Harvard and England's Royal College of Physicians have lectured at the medical school. And this was set up, as I say, in 1977 when George Bush was director of the CIA. And in 1970, the CIA decided that they would eventually take over this area because in 1979, the 77 rather, is when the school was set up. In 79 is when Bishop came in. But they had a contingency. Jonestown was set up in 1973-74 when we were fighting Ronald Reagan's school at UCLA for mind control, and rather it went back as early as 1971, 72. They were able to stop. We were able to stop in the Congress and Sam Ervin, the UCLA area, and then when the case broke up about Jonestown, from 73 to 74, they moved down to Guyana, and Mark Lane said this was the greatest hospital. It was used for all of Guyana and South America, and it was a renowned hospital. And I thought it was a continuation for experiment, and it turned out to be a place of experimentation and mind control. So on the island of Grenada is this mental hospital that quickly everyone is either killed or evacuated. And I got out my articles on Dr. Bourne. He worked with Jimmy Carter, and Dr. Peter Bourne worked in Southeast Asia with Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. He worked with Richard Nixon with the White House plumbers, with Egil Crow and the White House plumbers. Then he went on to Jimmy Carter, and he left the administration because he gave a prescription to a woman for some Quaaludes. But during the Jimmy Carter administration, Peter Bourne was the one who had paid off the Mexican government to put $13 million. It actually came out to more than $40 million to put the chemical paraquat into marijuana so that the hippie generation, the young people, would be getting cancer of the lungs from that. That's another thing we were talking earlier before World Watchers started about AIDS for the homosexuals, or Tay-Sachs for the Jews and sickle cell for the blacks, and paraquat poisoning lung cancer for the hip generation later when they grew up. That was a subject that I've been very interested in, singling out those people by spraying a cancer-causing ingredient on marijuana for a particular segment of the population. You notice they don't put it into scotch and make people who drink scotch maybe they do give them cancer. I don't know. But Peter Bourne, who was so controversial with Agent Orange, he worked with Richard Nixon. He came from London, Oxford, England, and came to the United States in August of 1939. He was born and then came to the U.S. and studied medicine at Emory, and his father also was there, evidently. And like John Reese of Western Golds came from London. So that this particular medical school has the father in charge of Dr. Peter Bourne, and Peter Bourne was working for the CIA. He was working for the drug control of Richard Nixon in the White House with the White House team. That's Henry Kissinger again. And here we have Mr. Carrington, the Prime Minister of England, wanting to mess around with the government down in Barbados. So he was involved with the paraquat program, and he also brought in the rock musicians and the drug scene. Dr. Peter Bourne, for Jimmy Carter's administration, there was a lot of talk of cocaine and rock music and drugs. That you see how it faded away. It wasn't a part of Jimmy Carter's life at all, but in a way it was to discredit him. And Mrs. Bourne, Mary Bourne, was on the staff of Jimmy Carter's administration, and she was married, in case you don't remember it, to Dennis Sweeney. She married him before she married Peter, and then Dennis was a student identical to the one, this Leonard Keeley, the terminal man that I talked about earlier in the program. Dennis was a top student at Stanford University that went down to Mississippi with the Freedom Riders and fought the segregation in the South, and he was very active in political activity, and he met Alan Lowenstein down there and thought that Alan Lowenstein had turned against the society and worked for the CIA, which Lowenstein did. And Dennis Sweeney is the one who murdered Alan Lowenstein, the Democrat who was assisting with the last Democratic elections and with Ted Kennedy's campaign. So the Bournes have been involved in a lot of different activity. Mary divorced Dennis Sweeney after his head was completely gone, and then married Dr. Peter Bourne, who was active with Agent Orange in Vietnam and with the paraquat spraying in Mexico, and with Richard Nixon's White House team, the drug program, and then Jimmy Carter. And now his father is the one who's active in the hospital down there as excuse for invading the hospital. That was excuse. So if you want to take over an island, and you have plans to take over an island, You set up a CIA medical school, and then if you have a pretense the school is in danger, you can take over the whole island. After they admitted that they didn't have to go in this way and the school wasn't in danger, other articles followed. Here's one from the Washington Post. Americans may not have been in peril. And then another one for the San Francisco Examiner. Medical students' danger is a lie. And when it all siphones out, they weren't in trouble at all. And the question still remains, who was in the mental hospital? How many were in there? And were they under mind control? The medical school aspect could have been very much a part of a continuation of the Jonestown mind control experimentation that moved up to Grenada. And there were a hunk of them in the Barbados. Now, this past week, I listed the dates, the chronology of this invasion because of the military taking over that I said the first part of the program. And the sliding in of Mr. McFarlane, and Joseph Kraft had an interesting article about replacing Mr. Clark in the National Security Council, how he slipped into place October the 13th, and the infighting of the White House between Mr. James Baker and William Casey. And he details all the people in the White House that have been fighting each other, the plans to pretend that Baker would become National Security Advisor, and that Mr. Meese doesn't like Baker, and Mr. Casey doesn't like Baker, and Mr. Weinberger doesn't like Baker. So first they'd say, we'll put in Baker, and then the argument for the extreme right wing is, no, we'll use Gene Kirkpatrick. And they pacified people and was a total diversionary, and then it turns out that they used McFarlane of the Marines, and he's in there 3 days, and then he does a military operation that they planned a long time in advance. So the Washington Post has a story. State Department denies the reports that the U.S. used a pretext for the invasion. And then another story from the San Francisco Chronicle, chronology of Ronald Reagan's decision. And it tells how he decided to invade the island. He had a meeting on October 15th, when there hadn't been a murder and there hadn't been a curfew, and they were sitting in Washington making the plans, and how they first decided they'd do it the week of the World Series because everybody would be watching the World Series. Well, I like that article because I know they use events like that as diversionaries, and the chronology of the invasion was based upon the time, let's use the World Series, but that didn't work. The World Series came and went. That was to be their diversionary on October the 15th and 16th. And the Marines left the United States on the 17th to go down there, and Bishop was murdered on the 19th of October. And then the mental hospital was bombed out, and the news was completely cut off. And as you know, the controversy there, I have the transcript. It was printed in the newspaper of the news people, and Helen Thomas and Sam Donaldson challenging Larry Speaks on why we have to go to the Pentagon for news, so that the National Security Council went into the date they were down there ready to take over at 2:45 a.m. And one article says the decision was made while Ronald Reagan was playing golf. Well, it was made several years ago, as I said. The minute that there was an election there in 1979, the decision was made. And I knew at the time he played golf in Augusta that man going into the clubhouse was a total diversionary. At 2:45 in the morning, he was awakened with the story of the invasion into Grenada. And then the 16th hole of golf that day is that diversionary at the clubhouse. And at 2:27 a.m., the Marines were killed in Beirut, Lebanon, 220 of those. And I'll do more on the provocateur aspects of that next week. This was a bloody massacre that was set up. There weren't a lot of people killed, but it is a symptom of something that's going to happen. Grenada went smoothly because it's like taking the 18th hole of a golf course. But it'll continue to eat up all the islands, and then they'll come around and get us. Well, the hour is up, so I've got to go. It's the end of World Watchers. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week on KAZU-FM, Pacific Grove, California.